So welcome everybody. My name is Bob Ortung. I'm now actually my new title is Professor of Sustainability and International Affairs. Regardless if anybody knows what that actually is, I'm a professor of it. So I enjoy that.
Trying to figure out what it is.
what it is we're talking about here. So that's often the first question. But here today we're going to talk about something much more specific, which is when left moves right. And so Maria Snegovaya is going to give a presentation of her book. And actually, I just remembered, I was looking at all your different jobs. It seems like you have 3 different jobs at the moment,
Yeah.
so, including one here at George Washington University. So I'm going to go with that. So a scholar from George Washington University and a bunch of other places. So the floor is yours. Why don't you speak for about a half an hour, then we'll have Mitch Ornstein give some comments, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers.
Thank you so much, everyone. Honored to be here, and certainly honored to be collaborating with the Liberalism Studies program, which is a very, unfortunately, still very timely topic. Now, how do I launch my slides?
Uh-oh, the guy who does that just left.
No, that's fine. I think I got, there we go, all good.
Then there's this little icon at the bottom. The screen, this one. Present your presentation. Next one.
That's one. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm really honored and also relieved to finally have this book out. You, or many of you, probably know me as a scholar of Russia primarily. Now, this project is partly the product of failure in political forecasting. As you know, political scientists are good at explaining things, not so good at predicting things. And when I was studying in 2013, with selecting topic for my PhD, Russia was nowhere near on the horizon. I felt that nothing interesting is happening with Russia. And that was the moment when Viktor Orban just gave his prominent speech on illiberal democracies, and it became really an inspiration for me to try and understand how do societies that have a lot of experiences of non-freedoms, lack of freedoms, suddenly having regained those freedoms with a lot of struggle and effort, for some reason eventually end up abandoning them. And that's one of the questions that motivated this whole research. More specifically, however, the topic of today's conversation is the rise of populist right in contemporary East Central Europe as a function of failures on the side of mainstream parties. And I'm really honored to have Mitch Ornstein here, whose work has been one of the major inspiration in my research. Now, there's obviously a lot happening in the book. I'll try to provide you with a synopsis of it without getting into too many details. So, apologies in advance that the situation, it's not going to be perhaps too deep of emerge into this topic. Now, what is the puzzle to us? Well, first of all, most of you gathered here today know that populism, right populism, is a phenomenon of today's period. I was a little bit upset in 2018 when I finished my PhD that the topic will kind of disappear, but fast forward 2024, I'm not upset anymore about this topic stopping being relevant. But specific for Eastern European context, here, quick disclosure, I call the region Eastern Europe, even if technically it's Central Eastern Europe, just for simplicity. In Eastern Europe, the spread of right-wing populism is a particularly serious phenomenon. The share of the vote share of these parties has tripled in the last decade, and it was particularly in this context where a more successful incumbent populist leadership was in power throughout much of the last decade. This process, though, does not happen in the vacuum. It is accompanied by a simultaneous process of decay of the other party family, social democratic parties or center-left parties, which sometimes happens really in parallel. So this is not my graph, this is the graph from The Guardian using parallel data that demonstrate as the social democratic vote in Europe more broadly. On the red line on this graph, and the rise of populist radical right vote. The blue line on this graph is just very illustrative to demonstrate that there's a certain degree of parallelism, similarity in this process. Eastern Europe is not an exception. As you see, this is the graph on the top. Indeed, here as the social democratic parties in both Hungary and Poland were in decline in terms of their vote share, we have seen almost a parallel rise of populist right parties, Fidesz, Jobbik, and Law and Justice in Polish context. So the questions are that motivating this research, therefore, asking why do we see social democrats in decline and populist right parties on the rise? And most importantly, are these two trends related? The difference between my work and much of the scholarship on this topic, and those of you who are familiar with this literature know that there's no lack of scholarship trying to explain this phenomena, is that usually they treat the two processes as being distinct, separated from each other. In my work, I'm trying to bring them together, and that's one of the main contributions. Another important question is, why do we see such pronounced parallels in these trends across both Western and Eastern Europe? My focus is primarily Eastern Europe, as I said, but you can see much of the same phenomenon in the Western European context. And as much as us, Eastern Europeans, like to think of ourselves as being very special, there's certainly a lot of parallels in these trends, which my book is also trying to explain. Now, in the interest of time, I don't have much time today, I'm going to skim through the alternative explanations that focused on the phenomenon of, for example, decay of the left parties. As I mentioned before, there are multiple arguments made in that regards, but be it the changing voter profile or the new cleavages that emerged in Western European politics in particular, allowing, for example, populist right parties to more successfully politicize this agenda not providing disadvantage to left parties. As we can see, they usually face challenges in explaining all of this dynamic. For example, empirically, there is issues explaining the decay of the left parties through the change in socioeconomic profile of the electorates alone. Something else is happening, obviously. Plus, despite the fact that we see these parallel trends in both Western and Eastern Europe, the scholarship in both contexts tended to offer different explanations. So in Western Europe, some of the explanations are presented on this slide. In Eastern Europe, the explanations are more context-specific, focusing either on this fragility and relative novelty of these democracies, leading to stronger anti-incumbent bias or weaker party organization, or the role of corruption, which obviously is extremely plays a major role in Eastern European context. Yet again, while certainly I want to flag that this explanation certainly deserve a lot of attention, they're not explaining everything that's happening. And part of the problem, we can go back to those some of these arguments later, if our time allows us. Part of the problem is that these are the two group explanations that are distinct. They're not explaining the phenomenon that unravels across both contexts, and therefore clearly something else is happening beyond those arguments that are being offered. And what is it that's happening? I'm going to try and offer my explanation today. Now, first, a little bit of the background. In political science, we think of political competition often, for simplicity, as unraveling in a two-dimensional political space along two dimensions. The vertical dimension, the so-called social-cultural dimension, focuses on these issues pertaining to the cultural cleavages, migration, like emphasis on national values versus, I don't know, openings, a more social conservative agenda versus more progressive liberal agenda. On the horizontal dimension, we see the economic axis spanning from the far left, which emphasizes redistribution, state control, active role of the state in the economy, and the more pro-market position on the right, including all sorts of more neoliberal policies, essentially limiting state interference in the economy and limiting redistribution. As you can see on this graph, in the second half of the 20th century, usually social democratic parties found themselves in the top left part of this dimension, the top left quadrant, essentially adopting more redistributionist position on the economic dimension, but being fairly cosmopolitan on the social cultural dimension. By contrast, populist right parties would historically find themselves in the bottom right quadrant, being nativist, but especially in early 1990s, fairly pro-market in terms of their economic agenda. The left, when aligned as such, the positions of the social democratic parties tended to be more aligned with the preferences of the working class electorates, and especially in the second half of the 20th century, these positions helped to keep working classes within the mainstream politics. The Social Democrats kept fairly moderate stances on social cultural dimension, therefore preventing a possibility of fragmentation and polarization of the working class vote, much in the same way that it happened in the period preceding the Second World War, when working classes were essentially incorporated by fascist far-right movements and eventually ended up, which contributed obviously to the Second World War in the long term. However, in the second half, in the end of the 20th century, the Western European left parties face difficult choices. Globalization that starts unraveling throughout that period makes the earlier strong redistributionist stances on economy increasingly more difficult. This is further compounded by the fact that by late 80s it becomes clear that communism is not sustainable, the Soviet Union, the communist system collapses, and the Keynesianist policies that were often adopted by these parties in the second half of the 20th century also prove economically unsustainable, leading to great inflation, and essentially something needs to be changed. That is further compounded by the changing socioeconomic profiles by the electorates. The economies in these countries are transitioning to post-industrial stage, and accordingly the sheer sizes of working class groups is shrinking. So these parties start looking for an alternative, and this alternative becomes known as the third way. The third way type of policies is an effort by social democrats to essentially incorporate, to face the reality of the globalized world and much more open economies, while still keeping some of the original ideas of social equality. That leads to this quite a hybrid, social democratic third way hybrid, when some emphasis on the importance of equality continues, but it's more equity now, equal opportunities rather than emphasis on the equality of the outcomes, more emphasis on the balanced budgets instead of spending, and instead of strong state control, the emphasis on decentralization. At first, looks like it's successful. This approach is successful, and it's often picked up by social democratic parties in the Eastern European context. Now, who are these parties and who are the social democrats of Eastern European context? Well, very often those are the old communist parties which now, in early 1990s, are faced with this tough choice when they have somehow rebrand themselves to adjust to the market and also to reject the tainted communist past. So this is exactly the moment when the left in the Western brands. And it sounds like it's a great opportunity for post-communist left parties as well, when they adopt much more pro-market agenda, and often, as one of my interviewees in the book points out, become cooler than the Pope in the strive to adopt pro-market principles and policies and to reject the past. Right? They don't want to be associated to the redistributive communist policies of the communist era. Why then, you can ask, am I focusing specifically on Eastern Europe in my presentation and in my book, while the trends are somewhat paralleled across the two regions? Well, that is because, as among other Mitchell Orenstein's work demonstrate, the adoption of the pro-market policies in the context of this region happens much faster, quicker, and during a much shorter period of time. And while the policies are similar across both regions, in the region with the legacy of the communist redistribution, where many of the social groups are still not used to living on the market, they're dependent on state benefits and spoils, this leads to much stronger backlash in the long term, and therefore, for our purposes, it's actually much easier to personalize. Fortunate for these groups, but easy for us people, social scientists. Therefore, in my analysis, I focus specifically on this region, more in particular on the four Visegrad countries: Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. Now, in the context of the Eastern Europe, while this rebranding of the left parties unravels, what also is important to mention is the role of the European Union. The chapter which is devoted to the European Union is called, in my book, The Road to Hell is Paved with Good Intentions. That is because nobody really expects bad things to happen when the EU accession requirements push these parties in corresponding countries towards adoption of more pro-market reforms. It's very understandable. You want to standardize the requirements for everybody, and you want these economies, corresponding countries, to be in best possible shape prior to the accession. However, what it ends up doing is that no matter which party is in power at any given moment, given that there is general impetus to reform, to join the EU, and the societies are highly motivated in that regard, whether it's left or right in power becomes ultimately irrelevant for the types of economic policies that they adopt. Whether, especially in Poland, it becomes quite notable that throughout 15 years, Polish voters repeatedly vote into power right and left parties, one after another, but no matter which party it is, they end up conducting pretty much the same set of policies, which, by the way, made one of the left party economic leaders to be described as being their own Balcerowicz, even if Balcerowicz is the name associated to the shock therapy on the right, but ultimately there wasn't much difference between the two. Specifically, particularly important in that regard is the rule of the Maastricht criteria, which requires to lower inflation, fiscal deficit, and moderate indebtedness by the states. What it does, as some of the scholarship has demonstrated, is that in early 2000s, it forces these countries to eliminate some of the social protections and guarantees which these countries preserved throughout the 1990s to protect a little bit the economically vulnerable electorates from the deleterious effects of the market. And while the policies certainly help to contribute to the ultimate outcome, the accession to the EU, over time, this also leads to accumulated resentment. The resentment becomes more pronounced as the accession nears. By mid-2000s, in the context of these parties, and as I argue, this is extremely important to understand the timing of the emergence of the populists in this context. Prior to the EU accession, before it's guaranteed, other parties are wary about adopting Eurosceptic platform because this may backfire. They might end up costing this narrative may end up costing the countries the accession. But once accession is secured, two things happen. First of all, challenger parties are free to adopt any rhetoric they like because they already have secured the accession, and the costs associated to the transition and the fact that economic well-being doesn't just happen all of a sudden, contrary to what many have expected, leads to accumulated resentment, particularly among the groups that find themselves on the losing side of these reforms. In my work, I focus particularly on the blue collars, working class electorates, and it's specifically around the time of the EU accession that we see the spread of the populist actors in the region. And the backlash particularly is pronounced among working class electorates. Now, why specifically working classes? Well, as I have mentioned before, these are the groups, first of all, that are typically associated to left parties' supporters. However, as the left parties increasingly adopt more pro-market policies, over time, these policies end up alienating the working class electorates. At first, they're willing to tolerate the rebranding of the parties, hoping that it's a short-term thing, it's needed for the political considerations, but in the long term, the left parties kind of will go back to their original promises. But over several electoral rounds, this does not happen, and they end up being alienated by the adoption of reforms by their parties. In the Eastern European context, these effects end up being much more serious for corresponding policies. This is because, as I show, just the sheer size of the working class electorates, on this graph I select service workers, clerks, and production workers combined, represent about 60% of corresponding electorates, so about 2/3 of electorates. It might be not the best idea to conduct policies that can risk alienating 2/3 of possible voters. This is less of an issue in Western European context where, as a result of transitioning to post-industrial stage, the sheer size of the working class electorates have been actually shrinking over time. So for Western Europe, the adoption of the third wave policies is less consequential than it is for Eastern European context. Now, also, it's very important that, and sorry, this is very hard to see, but essentially, that the working class preferences are aligned in a particular area on this two-dimensional political space. I've argued before, as you remember, right, that this is a two-dimensional political space structuring the voter preferences along the social, cultural, and economic dimensions. As you can see in the 4 countries of my interest, all of the working classes are located in the bottom left quadrant, that are more pro-redistribution oriented, but also more nativist, more social cultural conservative than other electorates. Now, what do you think happens when social democrats move to the center of the economic dimension while adopting more pro-market policies? They end up alienating the groups whose preferences are located on the more redistributionist side of the spectrum, and they end up vacating the space for populist right parties, which see this opportunity and adopt more redistributive, protectionist economic platforms, therefore perfectly aligning their stances with those of the working class electorate. Eventually, we see that the representation of the working class groups among these populist right parties increases. In the Western Europe, it is known as the phenomenon of proletarization of the populist right vote. And as I show in this book, we see entirely very similar dynamic in the Eastern European context. Accordingly, this analysis leads me to 3 hypotheses: that pro-market stances of left parties reduce their support and increase support for populist right parties, and the effects are more pronounced among economically vulnerable electorates, working class groups. So in order to, I have a variety of tests of this hypothesis in the book. Here I'm going to quickly present you two of the alternative testing methods. So the first analysis is essentially lumping together 45 elections in 10 Eastern European countries and trying to see the effects of more pro-market policies on support of left and populist right parties correspondingly. I classify socioeconomic groups for my purposes using the classic Ursch classification schema. This is the graph that shows the distribution of the left parties along the economic scale. From zero, redistribution is to neoliberal. As you can see, over time, there is a degree of variation that allows us to conduct the analysis with, by the way, Hungarian left party being extremely pro-market in, for example, 2006. So what I do, I essentially interact support. I see how the support for the given left party varies depending on its position on economic issues with a lag. So here is the first hypothesis, and I'm going to spare you the details. We can go back to these questions during the Q&A. But essentially, indeed, you see that more pro-market parties with a higher position on economic openness tend to face decreased levels of support. And this is just the graph, predicted marginal probability that shows that it is indeed true. Most importantly, I then interact the economic positions of the parties with particular social occupational categories. And just as expected, we see that these effects of adoption of more pro-market policy positions, economic policy positions, are associated to reduce support primarily among working class electorates, just as my theory would expect me to predict. And the coefficient is larger to production workers, which arguably are the most likely to find themselves on the losing side of these reforms. Again, this is the graph that demonstrates this dynamic. Here, it's a little bit hard to see, but in general, you see that nobody likes pro-market left parties. The slope is always negative. But the effects are particularly pronounced among, again, working class electorates, production workers, clerks, and service workers. Lastly, how about populist right party support? Indeed, here the dependent variable is vote for conservative and radical right parties in the same countries with more pro-market left parties. And what you see here is that indeed in such countries we see an increased support for these parties primarily among working class electorates. So in other words, this is the empirical confirmation of the argument. Indeed, we see that adopting pro-market stances ends up quite consequential electorally for the left parties and ends up offering an opportunity for populist right parties, especially among economically vulnerable electorates. Now, this is part of the story, but it does not tell us what happens, how do populist right parties best outreach to these groups? Does it help them more when they adopt purely nativist agenda, or is it better when they combine it with some redistributionist positions on economy? So to address that question, I also ran an experiment in Hungary. The experiment is run in the context of 2018 parliamentary elections in Hungary. The reason was that during that period, the left party, in an effort, the pro-market left party of Hungary, in an effort to regain some of the lost positions, actually adopted quite redistributionist slogans called "Let's do justice, let the rich pay," essentially trying to appeal to its electorate. And therefore, for the purposes of the experiment, it was quite convenient for me to tell my respondents two parts of the story, right? That first of all, the left is neoliberal and the left is also redistributionist, and both would be credible because MHP, the left party, has shown itself adopting both types of the stances. So accordingly, the treatment looked like an excerpt from a quasi-independent newspaper. It's actually hard to find an independent newspaper in Hungary these days. And the first treatment said that MHP focused on this more distributionist stances. This is actually consistent with the actual platform of the party in that election. But an alternative treatment actually provided more neoliberal argument that MHP will actually push for economic openness. At the same time, when it comes to Jobbik, I also provided two alternative types of treatment. First of all, that the Jobbik will adopt, the far-right party of interest in this particular experiment, would adopt more redistributionist and protectionist economic stances, but alternative that Jobbik will actually adopt much more nativist, radical platform. And the question was, which of these two alternative stances, given the treatment, the much more pro-market MHP, left party, will give Jobbik more electoral advantage. So essentially the dependent variable here is how likely it is that you will vote for Jobbik in this forthcoming election. And I expect that indeed adopting more for distributionist position will give Jobbik more electoral advantageous position. And indeed that's what I find here in adoption, a treatment, the treatment that's associated to much more, to the more pro-market position by the left party, actually is associated to increased support for the Jobbik party as long as the Jobbik party adopts more distributionist platform. The other hypothesis is that we expect this effect more pronounced among working class groups. And as you can see on this graph, the effects are not awfully strong, given the limited size of the sample, but they are suggestive that this is true. Indeed, the effects, the support for Jobbik under these conditions is higher among working class electorates. Now, in the interest of time, I will not show you the results of the other experiment, and you're going to have to trust me or to read the book or to see that when I repeat the same experiment, except that Jobbik adopts nativist stances, we see no effects on Jobbik support. So it's very important that under condition of more pro-market left parties, populist right parties actually adopt redistributionist or protectionist stances, and that's indeed what they what they do, especially after the 2008 financial crisis. So they have figured it out too, unfortunately, for us. They need to adopt protectionist economic platforms to appeal to their supporters. The main takeaway here is that you can't just claim that this is that the populist right voters are just xenophobic and racist, right? While it's certainly true, we have seen that they're located in the bottom quadrant when it comes to the nativist stances. The story goes far beyond that, right? These are genuinely economically vulnerable electorates that just need to be appealed to with the right set of policies. And it goes beyond just xenophobia and racism. There's also quite legitimate economic demands there. To conclude, Eastern Europe, as much as we love its idiosyncrasy, is not unique in this dynamic that has been unraveling over the last decades. In fact, the patterns of the decay of the center-left and the rise of the populist right are quite generalizable across multiple regions and contexts. Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and even Latin America, probably even beyond that, but these are just the three regions I'm most familiar with. And these patterns show that while rebranding and becoming more pro-market helps center-left parties in the short term, in the long term it ends up alienating their classic electorates, working class groups, and leads to their demise because they're unable to fully substitute with the influx of middle-class voters. Middle-class voters have multiple options to pick from, the center-right, the center-left. They don't stick around and as we have seen in Eastern European context, there's just not too many of them to fully substitute for losing literally 2/3 of their electorates. Having said that, certainly Eastern Europe has a lot of its own uniqueness, and that has to do with the fact that, first of all, the effects of the rebranding in post-communist contexts have been much more pronounced than in the West, because it's been much of larger scale, happening in a very condensed period of time, pushed forward by international institutions, leaving little leeway for mainstream parties, and sharpening the divisions between reform winners and losers in the context of a society of societies used to with the legacy of state redistribution. So the effects were simultaneously stronger and more painful in this context. Plus, of course, the tainted communist legacy left more opportunities to challenge these neoliberal incumbents from the right side of the political spectrum. In Latin America, for example, we see very similar dynamic, but the challenges usually rise on the left, just because in Latin America we don't see this painful legacy of communism. But the most important difference is the sheer size of the working class electorates. Very often, Western European industries have been moved to Eastern Europe. So while Western Europe has actually transitioned to post-industrial stage, that was not the case in Central Eastern European context, leaving the effects of this adoption of pro-market reforms much more consequential for the left parties. Lastly, these are just very young, vulnerable, less institutionalized polities where maybe there's less tradition of partisanship, and therefore it's just easier for voters, large chunks of voters, to move from one side of the political spectrum to another, and hence the mistakes of mainstream parties are much more consequential for them. Having said that, to put this whole dynamic in the broader picture, this is also the story about sustainability of the liberal democracy. As I argue, we are in today's world and context may be facing the good old Polanyi problem of trying to combine free markets with stable polities. And that is unfortunately not easy in the context when a significant share of those polities still needs a lot of redistribution and is susceptible to populist redistributionist appeals. It's important to remember that social democratic parties play an extremely important stabilizing function in liberal democracies by helping to keep groups that otherwise potentially are prone to shifting to the extremes in the center of the political spectrum. And they've been successfully doing it in the post-war period in the Western Europe. When that did not happen, when center-left parties are in demise, we see a lot of their supporters essentially being available for mobilization by potentially very radical parties, political actors. We literally see that happening in the United States, in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, and it can potentially have very detrimental outcomes for our polities. Therefore, it's really important to think of ways to curtail that dynamic, especially given the fact that populist right parties are prone to compete on social cultural dimension, that is identity appeals, the polarizing appeals, xenophobic, racist claims that make it much harder to find a common ground. It's much easier to find a common ground on redistribution than it is on identity. Accordingly, the book calls for us to think about ways to help center-left parties to regain their traditional electorates, and one possible lesson to learn from is actually the populist right parties and the policies that they adopt. Perhaps that would be one way for social democrats to try and rebrand itself, and ultimately for us to stabilize liberal democracy in this new era of globalization. And I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your interest. The book is available on the website.
All right, thank you very much, Maria. So I'll give my chair to Mitch. And
Okay,
make some
great.
comments.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss this fabulous book with you today. I'm Mitchell Ornstein from University of Pennsylvania, and I should say that I first got to know Maria actually when she was in graduate school, just by her reputation. I was actually already impressed with her before I met her, because during her graduate career at Columbia, she actually had already become a kind of really articulate critic of the Putin regime and of its foreign policy, disinformation, many other aspects. And so I took note of that, and I was like, oh, that's pretty interesting. This grad student is, writing all these really insightful columns, and she has really established a reputation for herself in Washington as being one of the foremost Russian critics of the Putin regime. And I guess what impressed me about that is, of course, the bravery of doing that. That it was more remarkable to me at the time, but as time has gone on, I think we've seen how few Russian citizens have actually been willing to take that type of a stance, and obviously also to be, extremely acute in their analysis. So it's just, I just want to say that, she really stands out, and even more so now to me in that respect, as being brave, and also, or maybe you could say having just a very different perspective for many Russians. One thing that underlined that to me, Maria, I hope you don't mind me saying, is that I recently made the mistake of calling her Masha, because Masha is like the typical, I don't know if you say typical nickname basically in Russian. For somebody called Maria, and she informed me, no, it's she doesn't use that, and she's in fact just Maria. That's the first time I'd literally heard that from anybody. So, maybe she just has a different perspective, but I'll leave others to figure that out. But I want to say, as she began this book is not about Russia. This book is about Europe, and what's really distinctive also about her career so far is that she has this strong, this powerful argument about party systems in Europe and the rise of populism. And you can see these two things being connected in a sort of, as you said at the end, a sort of broader concern about democracy, right? And about the rise of tyranny, essentially, that I think is the connective tissue that brings these two things together. So with that said, to my mind, this project is very important, largely because it makes, as you said at the end, a very strong political economy argument in a field which is dominated. The field of populism studies is dominated by people who believe that populism is really rising just because of racism, primarily because of racism, or primarily because in Europe of anti-immigrant feeling, which is kind of the same thing, I guess. There's always been alongside of that a sort of second trend in opinion, which has sort of said, no, there are actually political economy reasons for the rise of populist parties. But generally that's been like secondary, a secondary argument. I think this book makes one of the strongest cases, I think, that the political economy explanation is primary. The reason that these parties have risen to the power is essentially political economic. It's basically because of the disillusionment of working class voters with the center left parties that embrace neoliberalism, and basically moving to support populist parties that have themselves moved in their economic positions towards a more traditional left perspective. And that can be seen in the pro-family policies of Orban, or of Putin actually, or many other, Marine Le Pen's, for instance, always going to visit factories, right, talking about job loss, protecting pensions. All these dimensions have become an important part of the populist agenda. People recognize, but some people think that's of primary importance, and some people think that's of secondary importance. And for Maria, this is of primary importance. So what are the arguments? Well, she produces an enormous amount of data in the book to substantiate the primacy of this socioeconomic variable. To me, the most important one, I think, is actually contained in this contrast she makes between Western and Eastern Europe. Because in the East European cases, actually we see the most populism, right? The most success of populist parties, where populist parties actually come to power in Hungary and in Poland for very long periods of time. And yet, what? How can you explain that in anti-immigrant terms or in racist terms when there's really no immigrants at all? None. If you recall back to during the immigration crisis in 2015, 2016, those countries were asked collectively to take in 5,000 immigrants. And they said, no, we're not going to take them because that would have been like a doubling or tripling of immigration from the southern countries. So what you have is this kind of unbelievable contrast where everybody in West Europe thinks that this is because of anti-immigrant sentiment, but in fact, in East Europe, there's no immigrants, and so how could this possibly be about anti-immigrant sentiment? This is really one of the strongest arguments, I think, in addition to many other pieces of argument. For instance, public opinion surveys which show that left voters or working class voters are much higher propensities to switch to vote for populists. And also, of course, the experiments that you mentioned at the end, which also show in an experimental environment that working class voters are much more open to the appeals of populists. So that's why I think it's, that if that's the number one reason why I think this is an important project, that's what it is this very, very strong, that's why I think it'll be seen in the academic literature as a very, very strong statement in favor of the socioeconomic bridge. The other thing that she does that's also important, maybe I would say it's also important, but maybe more secondary to that one is what she talks about, just combining the East and West European literature. So there's this vigorous literature on populism that tends to be more divided into West and East. And this not only just talks about both things, but actually mobilizes, as I've said, the East Europe and West Europe literatures to sort of speak to one another in kind of critical ways, like about this issue of immigration. And she sort of leverages East Europe to show some things about West Europe, and also leverages West Europe to show some things about East Europe. So that, I think, will also have an impact. I want to raise, I don't know how many minutes I have, I want to keep on time here, but I want to raise one question, which is somewhat addressed in the book, but I think, we could think about a little more, which is the sort of international influences on this. So I know this is not neglected or absent from the book, because I've actually read those sections again today when I was on my way here, but I do think that there's an interesting story about the European Union's role in all this, right? Because in essence, the European Union, I would argue, pushed the center-left parties to embrace neoliberalism, okay? So the EU, particularly this is visible in East Europe, where they literally pushed them to embrace neoliberalism. And so, but I think also the EU has had this, throughout particularly East Europe, has had this very counterintuitive set of incentives that were created that in a way created this populist problem. For instance, it's frequently said, and you mentioned that this is a widely accepted argument in this field, that the post-communist left parties marched over to the right because they didn't want to be seen as communist anymore. I would argue that there is another reason that they marched over. It's because they desperately wanted to get into the EU because they were terrified of a populist explosion. So they thought that if we can anchor our policies in our countries in the European Union, that we'll be sort of like protected basically from some sort of indigenous tyranny that might arise, which of course it has arisen, right? But in a way, this book I think is also really important in showing that they sort of blew the whole game by doing so. By basically abandoning a lot of their traditional constituents, they actually made this prophecy come true. It became self-fulfilling. That they went into the EU, they abandoned their voters, and then those voters just marched over to the populist right, which they were afraid of anyway. And so they, in fact, caused the explosion that they were seeking to avoid. And I think that's important because the EU doesn't wrestle with a lot of the kind of perverse incentives that it kind of created on East Europe. And I think that I'd be interested to hear comments about that if I have one question. I'll just conclude by saying that where are we today? Well, the picture that comes out of this book is we're in a place where essentially there's a lot of disillusioned voters in Europe that used to have a home in the left or the center left, and now is shifting to the right, and it's because of, for instance, in Germany, which is in the news. I'll just pick on Germany here, but it's not just a story about Germany. But because of Gerhard Schröder, right? Gerhard Schröder, who basically as a German prime minister was the most vigorous advocate of neoliberalism. Okay, like Tony Blair before him or others. I mean, more neoliberalism, more liberalization happened under Schröder than under any other chancellor in Germany. And as a result, those voters who had supported, working class voters looked at this whole scene and said, forget this, what do we need a social democratic party for that has become, in line with the capitalists and is not really, we don't trust them anymore. It sort of was a breaking of this trust, and now they're hearing the appeals, the welfarist appeals, but also the anti-immigrant appeals of an AfD and going to vote for them instead. And so that's a unfortunate sort of situation. I don't know what the overall lesson is, but maybe the lesson for parties is you have to be really careful to be true to your own values because otherwise you can very easily lose voters if you start embracing somebody else's values, particularly if there's the opponent. If you're a working class party and you embrace capitalist values, that's a very dangerous maneuver. It's similar to like coalition politics. But in any case, I think it's a fantastic book, and encourage everybody to take a look. And of course, now open the floor to your questions. And I don't know if you want me to recognize or you want to do that.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I'll go ahead and